Okay, so our next topic. Now we've gotten through the basics of the nervous system. Let's now actually talk about the nervous system. Okay, this is one of my favorite topics. We're going to be talking about the central nervous system, which is really composed of just the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so I've got a lecture here. We're going to go through it, and we're going to be talking about here the central nervous system, which is, in my opinion, less complex than the peripheral nervous system because there's less parts. Okay. Okay, so we got the wrong slideshow here. So, pardon me for a second here. I shall see how I organize things here. Okay, here we go. Here's the slideshow that I'm looking for. Okay, so composed of the central nervous system is only two parts: the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? And the spinal cord is not the bones. Okay, sometimes when we think of the spinal cord, we think of all these vertebrates. We're talking about this long neuron that's traveling through there. Okay, it's not really just one neuron; it's several neurons, so we call it a nerve. So it's the brain and then the nerve that runs all the way down your spinal cord. So its main purpose is the control center. That's by far its main purpose. However, the brain, as well as the spinal cord, does have some sensors in it. Okay, so it can do some sensing. Even though most of our sensors would be in our peripheral, the brain does have some sensors, like I talked about before, the hypothalamus detecting temperature. Okay, so if you damage your central nervous system, it's variable. Okay, depending on the location of the damage, it can cause a variety of symptoms, including behavioral and personality changes. Okay. Damaging your central nervous system is usually pretty detrimental. Okay, depending on where it happens. I mean, if it happens in your brain, you're going to lose, a major function, some part of your life. And then down here in the spinal cord, it depends on exactly where it happens. We'll get to that in a little bit. So the brain and the spinal cord contain myelinated and unmyelinated neurons. Okay, if you remember, myelinated is to help us transmit signals. So really, really important signals that have to go long distances are myelinated. Less important signals are unmyelinated. Okay? So myelinated neurons are considered the white matter. Okay? So when we look at the brain, okay, the outside is what we consider gray matter, and those are unmyelinated neurons. But on the inside is the white matter. So on the inside is where all these really, really fast transmissions are going to happen because they're all myelinated. We can send impulses really, really quickly through the middle of the brain. On the outside, it can still be sent, but they're unmyelinated, so they're not going to be as quick as if they were myelinated. Okay. So unmyelinated neurons are considered the gray matter and are located mostly on the exterior of the brain and on the inner core of the spinal cord. So I want you to notice the difference between the spinal cord and the brain. Okay. The brain has gray matter along the outside. Okay. So not as quick transmissions along the outside of the brain, and then white matter on the inside. When we go to the spinal cord, it's the opposite. The spinal cord will have the gray matter on the inside, so slower transmissions, and then the really fast transmissions on the outside of the spinal cord. So this is an example of a nerve. Okay, this is a nerve fiber. There's a whole bunch of neurons in here. Okay, there's a whole bunch of neurons, axons running up and down in this little space, and they're all wrapped together into a nerve. There's just a better picture of the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, and then this is kind of a cross section of it. If you took the spinal cord and cut it in half, this is what you would see here. Okay. I'm just making a video here. So the spinal cord basics. Spinal cord connects to the brain and the peripheral nervous system. Okay? Within the spinal cord, sensory nerves from the PNS will carry messages from the body to the brain for interpretation. So you're going to get your messages from your PNS. You're going to have sensors all throughout your fingers and your arms and your hands, and they're going to send a message to your spinal cord. Okay? Your spinal cord is kind of there to redirect it up to your brain. Okay? Very few PNS go right to your brain, if any. Most of them are going to go to your spinal cord and then into your brain for interpretation. Your brain will interpret it, send it back to your spinal cord. Your spinal cord will then send it back out to the PNS. Okay? So motor nerves relay information from the brain to the effectors. And those are where the motor nerves are that we talked about it. So they're the ones that are going to go from your brain to your spinal cord and then out to your effectors. Okay. Now the one interesting thing about the spinal cord is that it used to be preliminary. It used to be our brain. Okay, as we evolved to grow a brain, but our spinal cord was really our initial brain. And very simplistic organisms don't have a brain, but they have a spinal cord, and that's considered their nervous system or their brain. Now we still retain some capabilities of our spinal cord acting as our brain, and this is seen when we have a reflex. So when we have a reflex, and see if I can get a good picture here. Okay, so when we have a reflex, what that is normally if I touch something, okay, so say I touched this letter B and it was on a table, a signal is going to go through my finger, okay, up to my spinal cord. My spinal cord is then going to send it to my brain. My brain is going to compute, okay, you're touching the letter B. It's going to send a message back to my spinal cord. Then my spinal cord is going to send a message back out to my hand that says, let go of B or press harder on B or whatever. Okay? But look how long that took. I have to go from here to my spinal cord, up to my brain, wait for my brain to commute it back to my spinal cord, and then back out. Well, in a reflex, and when we do reflexes, we don't have time to go all the way up to our brain. It's something like if you touch a hot plate, you don't have time for the message, you're touching something burning hot, to go to your spinal cord to send it to your brain. Your brain like, oh my God, you're touching something hot, you're burning your fingers, we got to remove your finger. So it sends it back down here and then back out. It takes too long. Now you'd have a burnt finger. So with what reflexes are, is basically the message goes to the spinal cord determines what should happen and then sends it back to the finger. It never goes to the brain. It's only for really, really quick, life-determining factors, like things that are going to cause you major injury. You're only going to use a reflex for. Okay, if somebody tells you they're going to beat you up, you're going to go send that message to the brain, right? Because the brain is going to compute, well, should I run? Should I fight? Should I defend? What's my defense going to be? Okay, but if someone just throws a punch at you unexpectedly, you don't have time for your brain to be thinking, well, what should I do in this situation? You're going to send that message to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord is going to immediately send back a motor response of duck or run or whatever. And those are what reflexes are. Okay, they're basically a message that gets sent to the spinal cord and then right back to the effector without ever going to the brain. Okay. Now, this last picture, I'm never going to ask you to label these things. Okay, there's a couple things in here you should know, like gray matter and white matter. Okay, but what I wanted to focus on in this picture is the idea that you have a separate neuron that senses things. So you're going to have a nerve fiber that runs that just is bringing sensory information into the spinal cord. Okay. Then you're going to have a separate neuron that basically sends the motor response to the effector, to the muscle. So why I wanted to emphasize this is you don't have a message that comes down one neuron and then goes the opposite direction down that neuron. Okay, we have neurons for sensing and we have neurons for moving. And the message never gets sent down the same neurons. Usually messages can only be sent one way. So when a sensory neuron sends a message, an action potential, it can only send it in one direction, away from, say, the fingertip and to the spinal cord. It can never send a message from the spinal cord to the fingertip on that neuron. If I want to send a message from the spinal cord to my fingertip or to the muscle, I have to send it along a different neuron. Okay. And again, there's a great video to watch. Okay, so now let's go into the brain. Now, for the brain, we have an activity. Okay, so you're going to log on to this website right here, and I highly suggest you print out these 2 slides on full pages. Okay, it's for a diagram. And what you're going to do is you're going to go to this website, and it basically has the brain all broken down. So you're going to click on, say, this part right here, and it's going to tell you what the part's name is. I'd like you to write down the function, and then what I'd like you to do is once you have this printed out, I'd like you to color this area. Okay? So that you have the color, like this is purple. Then you go blue, and you say you do the frontal cortex right here, or frontal lobe, and you color it in blue. Okay? That's the part, the frontal cortex, tell me the function, and then the diagram. So we have 2 parts, the exterior of the brain, and then when you click on that website, you'll see that you can click on the interior. And then I'd like you to do the interior of the brain and click on all the things that are inside the middle of the brain that you need to know, the parts and their function. So everything on this website, I'd like you to do. And that's going to be pretty much it for today. Okay? I'd like you to label those, to go through that. Actually, the last thing I want to talk about is just a couple more things. The blood-brain barrier. Okay, so the blood-brain barrier is just an area that we can't have regular blood exposed to our brain, so it gets selectively filtered. Okay? And it filters out things like bacteria or unknown organisms or certain toxins. Other things can pass right through it, like alcohol and caffeine. Okay? But it's just important to note that we have different blood floating around in our brain than we do have, say, floating around in our liver. It's extra filtered because it's very important. And the other thing we want to know about is the brain spheres. You've heard about these before, left brain or right brain. There is some reasoning behind it. So the cerebral cortex, which is our kind of our outer part here, can be divided into two spheres, the right and the left. They are connected, so they communicate with each other through the corpus callosum. So the right brain can communicate with the left brain via this little connection called the corpus callosum. Now each sphere has slightly different purposes. Okay? Now this isn't an exact science, but there is some reasons behind it. So the left brain is mostly responsible for logical and analytical thinking. So our math and science students, the ones that aren't very creative, they kind of like rules, they kind of like steps, they kind of like laws that govern the world. Okay. On the right side, it's the exact opposite. These are the kind of people that think are a little bit more emotional, are very creative, don't like following rules, can think outside the box. Okay? They're more considered our creative people, where these are more of our logical people. And generally speaking, people are usually left or right brain. Now, some people are very talented and are equally right and left brain, but most of the time, you predominantly are either left brain or right brain. Okay, so there's parts when we have the two halves are fighting. So there's two different areas in the brain compete. Two different areas compute different things. So what happens when one side provides an answer different than the other side? It's called the Stroop effect. So I'd like you to basically sit in your desk, and I'd like you to say these colors out loud. Okay? So I want you to say this out loud. And you might be able to say purple, but some people might say red. And I want you to say this. And I want to see what mistakes you're making. Because your logical side is going to read the word, and it's going to say purple. But your creative side is going to see the color, and it's going to say red. So you've got two conflicting answers here. Okay? Where you've got your left side of your brain saying the answer is purple, the right side of your brain saying the answer is red. And you're going to see, what side dominates, because whatever you start answering shows you kind of the side that is dominating in you. Okay? And it's just kind of an indicator, it's not a for sure thing. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is just how the brain can selectively shut things down. So what happens is when you faint, okay, the brain is basically saying, I don't have enough oxygen and glucose to perform cellular respiration, so I'm going to start shutting down non-essential things. And when it does that, your brain starts shutting down your muscles, your eyes, your auditory. So when you pass out, okay, that's actually your brain shutting you down. Your brain has basically said, we have a problem here. I can't support all of these functions. I can't support hearing and vision and muscle movement. So I'm shutting down all non-essential systems, and the only thing I'm going to keep going are my organs and my heart and my brain. Okay? And they make you pass out. And when you're passed out, you're not using a lot of energy. You're hardly using anything because you're just, barely surviving. And your brain has put you into that. Okay? Your brain also puts you into a coma in certain cases where, it's like, oh my God, we are not going to be able to survive running all these systems. Let's run the bare bones system, which is the brain, the heart, and several of the organs. Okay? So what I'd like you to do today is, again, your activity is to print out these things, go onto this website. Okay, I'll just quickly show you this website so you can see what it looks like. Oh my God, okay. Maybe I will. Okay, there we go. So here's our course website, and so here's the brain. Okay, and so I want you to click on the temporal lobe, and it's going to tell you what we use the temporal lobe for. Okay, then you're going to press to close this, and you're going to go to the parietal lobe, and it'll tell you what the parietal lobe is. Okay? So a good test question would be for me to ask you, well, what if you have a stroke, and your stroke blocks your parietal lobe? So someone who has a stroke and their parietal lobe was damaged, they're going to lose their sense of touch, taste, and movement. They're still going to be able to do things like whatever the temporal lobe does because they didn't have a stroke there. So they're still going to be able to hear and memorize things and speak. Okay? And if someone, say, had a stroke in the occipital lobe, okay, well, they're not going to be able to see anymore. They're still going to be able to do everything else, but they're not going to be able to see. So I'd like you to go through, what the function of each of these parts is, okay, and then keeping in mind that I may not just ask you, well, tell me what the function is. I might say, well, what if you have a stroke in the primary motor cortex? What's going to be your problem? Now, once you've gone through all the outside, the second part is going on the inside. I'd like you to label the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the hippocampus, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, and the same kind of thing, write down what their function is. All right, so that's it for today. We're going to be doing a brain dissection in class. So, I guess one of the disadvantages of being online is you won't get to do the dissection, but that's what we're going to be doing today. So hope you have a good day, and make sure you email me with any questions that you have. Okay. Tomorrow we'll be doing the PNS, and then we'll be done kind of the central nervous system. I'll do kind of a summary of what we need to know for that, and then we move on to our endocrine. We'll do a couple lectures of endocrine, and then our last one, excretory. Okay. Now, in terms of an evaluation, I'm not really sure. I'm not really thinking we're going to have a unit test in this because it'll be too close to the exam. And we here start exams, I think, in the Lambton-Kent board a little bit later than what you're starting in the Ottawa or the Carleton or the Thames Valley or the Hamilton. You guys are starting a little bit early, so I don't really want to give you a test when you're just studying for exams.